Hey everyone, welcome to another bonus episode of Gaslit Nation. I am going to announce, and by the way, I am on YouTube, so come keep me company on YouTube where I'm here hanging out with my trolls. You don't want to miss this, so come on down to the Gaslit Nation YouTube account. I am here. You're going to get the first part of this bonus as a video, and then we're going to go audio only. And this will be for our Patreon folks, the people that make our show possible by subscribing to Gaslit Nation at patreon.com/gaslit. That's patreon.com/gaslit. And there you can get every bonus episode, every episode ad-free, our full archives, access to exclusive invites, and more. So the first part of this bonus episode will be me doing audio and video, and then the second half will be Sarah doing audio only, answering questions submitted by our listeners. So first up, I want to share that I'm going to announce some of the winners of the free dictatorship book giveaway. We have the Gaslit Nation graphic novel Dictatorship, It's Easier Than You Think, which is a graphic novel for people of all ages. It's YA and up, and it shows how dictators come to power, how they try to stay in power, and how to ultimately defeat them. So obviously it's a book for our time, and we're going to be giving away a copy of the Gaslit Nation graphic novel once a month for the next, I think when we launched this, we said a year, so through next April. If you support the show on Patreon, you're going to get, you are automatically entered for a chance to get a copy of this book signed by both me and Sarah. And it's a thank you to our community that makes our show possible. And so the winners of July are, the July winner is Patreon supporter Chiquin. For August, the Patreon supporter is Brock. And for September, we will announce that soon for September. So there's still a chance to get your signed copy as a thank you to the folks that keep our team together and keep us producing and keep us saying what needs to be said. Thank you so much. And a reminder, this Monday, September 18th at 7 p.m. at P&T Knitwear, a wonderful independent bookstore on the Lower East Side, I will be in conversation with the historian Ruth Ben-Ghiat, the author of the best-selling book, Strong Men, and my good friend, Russian Mafia expert, because everyone needs a Russian Mafia expert in their lives. That's Olga Lotman. The three of us will be in conversation talking about the Gaslit Nation graphic novel, Dictatorship, lessons from that, and all of that in the larger context of, will Putin and Trump ultimately win? And what do we do? What can we do to stop them? What should Biden and the Democrats do to stop them? What should global leaders do to stop them? And so on. So if you can't make it to that event, or let's say you can make it to that event, if you support the show on Patreon, we're having a special meet and greet. I'll share the location exactly where I'll be starting at 6 p.m. To sign Mr. Jones posters for Patreon supporters and to give away free N95 masks, because COVID and long COVID are still very much with us. So I'll have a mask on, I'll have a mask for you if you need one, and we'll hang out. We'll hang out and take selfies with our masks and normalize mask wearing for everyone, because it's the right thing to do. And then the event starts at 7 p.m. So if you're signed up on Patreon, look out for details on where to meet up at 6 p.m. an hour before the show, which kicks off at 7 p.m. with me, Ruth, and Olga. I'm very excited for that because I love those ladies. All right, so now for something different. I want to share a bit of self-care with you all, because self-care is an extremely important part of the resistance. And that is a very simple, well, it's not that simple. I will say it was not that simple for me, but it's something very important that every single one of us should make time to do, and that is to interview someone you love. As you know from listening to the show, both Sarah and I have people in our immediate family, beloved family members, who are terminally ill. We're trying to manage the show, manage our projects through this difficult time. One thing that I made it a point to do when it was very clear that my loved one's health was in decline, I put together a list of questions to interview this person on camera to make sure that I collected as much information, knew as much as I could. It was very important to me to do this. And I waited too long to have this interview. I waited too long because when we finally got around to doing it, it was very difficult for this person to sit through this interview, and we had to cut it short. And in that short amount of time, I learned so much extraordinary information. So I'm telling you, whether you have the similar situation as I do or not, interview the people that you love. Do it now. And the excuse you give, the reason you give is simply this. I want to interview you. I have a list of questions provided by Andrea at Gaslit Nation. And they'll say, what's that? They're like, you don't know Gaslit Nation. But so I have a list of questions for you. And I want to talk to you. I can interview you over Zoom on camera, very simple, very easy. And the person, your parent, your grandparent, it could even be your child. The person might say, why? That's silly. What do I have to say? And all you have to tell them, the reason you have to give is, I want to do this because it's important to me and I love you. And that's it. So I'm going to share a list of questions with you. And I really do urge you to consider doing this while you have the time to do it. And don't delay. Don't delay. Because I'm telling you, if you haven't learned this yet, I've learned this. I've learned this and I've been reminded of this many times. We do not have as much time here as we think we do. We do not have as much time here with the people we love, the people who have made us who we are, as we think we do. And that's just the reality. So I know we all live very busy lives. I know we're consumed by these horrific headlines, but take a moment as an exercise of self-care, self-love, to celebrate the people who helped make you who you are, the people that you love, the people that you're emotionally dependent on, to celebrate them, whether they want to do it or not. Just try to encourage them that it's important to you, because I know not everyone wants to be interviewed. I know it's difficult. So just give it a try. Just see what it leads to, because I was very surprised to what my act of self-care and doing this, my act of family love, ancestral love led to in doing this. And I think it might be an interesting exercise for you. So in the show notes to this episode, you can find a link of questions that you could work off of. Very basic questions. It's just a starting point. And again, you don't need video cameras to do this. You could do it over Zoom, which has a video feature that you could just record the conversation over Zoom. And if you're concerned about privacy settings on Zoom, just do a quick Google search on that. There was a big uproar that Zoom was recording people and using what they say on Zoom for AI training. And the company then had to clarify and walk that back. But from what I've read, from what I've done in the settings, it's very easy to protect yourself on Zoom currently. So go ahead and just grab these interview questions, grab somebody or people, multiple people that you love, and just give this a shot of interviewing someone you love. And do it sooner than later. Learn from me and do it sooner than you think you maybe should. And I know it might be a difficult exercise for both people involved, but ultimately it's very exciting what you will learn along the way, and it's fun. And the whole hope is that people are reminded of how much they love each other and appreciate each other and how much we all need each other. All right, so I wanted to comment on a response to last week's bonus episode on why Biden must call a climate emergency, something he has not done since that post went out. We're still waiting, Biden. We're still putting pressure on you for that. That got a lot of responses. One of the responses to that piece was somebody writing in our Patreon community that given the way the world is headed, I'm just paraphrasing their comments, given the way things are headed, and obviously this is clear as day. Anybody that follows Gaslit Nation closely, anybody that follows the news closely can see the writing on the wall. Given how things are going, we inevitably are headed towards a time of mass violence, and mass violence will ultimately be what the oligarchs destroying everything will listen to. It's time to roll out the guillotine, right? Here comes the chopping block. And so I thought a lot about that, which is why I wanted to open with this. And the reality, it comes down to this. Violent revolutions in general, mostly do not succeed. Ukraine's Euromaidan is one of those very rare examples of a revolution that started off as peaceful and then quickly had to turn into self-defense very well organized, self-reliance, self-defense. Remember, people in Ukraine have required military training. So Ukrainians of all ages, from the teenagers through adulthood, they understood what to do and how to organize themselves when the riot police, the government snipers, were firing and violently attacking protesters. And plus, Ukraine had a lot of advantages that made that revolution successful. It was not only the mandatory military training across society, it was also that they had power elites in the country, yes, including oligarchs, that financially supported the protesters by paying for a stage, by paying for entertainment to keep people on the square. They also had just good old-fashioned city planning advantages, meaning they had this big, beautiful square, Maidan, in the heart of Kiev, that acted as a sort of trench. It became a trench where they just took over that square and closed off all the entry points, protected all the entry points. So they had so many benefits. And plus, Ukraine has centuries of a spirit of resistance through its art, through its culture, through its understanding of itself. It's a culture that's built on artists, many leading thinkers, academics who have ultimately been martyred over the generations simply for being Ukrainian, for writing and speaking and thinking Ukrainian and so on. And so Ukrainians very much understood being a colonized people that had to fight for their survival against Kremlin imperialist genocide. They understood that they had to fight. They had no choice but to fight. So the decision making was very quick. Anytime there were severe acts of violence, like a journalist getting their face bludgeoned to the point where their lips and eyes and everything swelled up, you couldn't even recognize them anymore. Viral images like that drove people to the square, drove out more protesters, and ultimately they overwhelmed the riot cops, and ultimately they won. And that was despite the best efforts of mealy-mouthed EU officials to try to come in and broker a peace deal that kept Yanukovych, the Ukrainian Trump, in power. Ukrainians were on their own in Euromaidan, and they won despite of everything. That's a very rare example of a popular uprising that is forced to become violent because of the violence inflicted on it by the government and is ultimately successful. Very rare. Most revolutions become like Animal Farm, where the violence comes in, creates a vacuum of power, and the biggest dog in the fight wins and turns it into a dictatorship, and it's just a new regime, maybe even worse as the one that was just overthrown. So that is why we start the Gaslit Nation Action Guide with MLK's memoir on the Montgomery bus boycott, which is a practical guide. It's a very hold your hand guide on how to do revolution the right way, the non-violent way, the sustainable way. And that is why we opened the Gaslit Nation Action Guide with that. That is a book that everyone should read. Non-violent resistance is always the answer. It is the most practical way. It is how you endure. It's how movements are sustainable. When I hear these calls for violence, they tend to come from white people, because white people can say that. White people can move in that direction because they're not the ones who are going to be executed on site by a police officer. They're not going to. White people live their lives not having to calculate and go and raise their children, trying to protect themselves from a virtual lynching, right? From a police officer, like a routine police stop, okay? So a lot of the calls for violence I'm seeing on social media tend to come from white people. And I'm telling you, going the violent route just opens up a vacuum that no one can control. Once you go violent, you give up control. The biggest, meanest dog in the fight wins, and what you're doing is you're attracting people that simply love the bloodlust. You're attracting the sadists. You're becoming what you're trying to overthrow. You lose control, and it can go anywhere. So no violence ever. It works against you. It's self-sabotaging. And the other point that I want to make, we are unfortunately heading towards inevitable mass violence for the simple fact that in 25 years, you're going to have an estimated well over 1 billion people displaced by the climate crisis. And that mass displacement is going to be ungovernable. And I am, of course, quoting the Pentagon itself. We're headed towards an ungovernable future if we don't do something now about the climate crisis. And when things become ungovernable, you're inevitably leading to mass violence, because you're going to have vigilante groups, you're going to have militias, you're going to have the Proud Boy groups consolidated to hunt migrants, and as they're doing now on the border in the U.S. and so on. And obviously you're going to have self-defense groups organizing and pushing back against that. So we are inevitably heading towards a time of mass violence, whether we want to or not. And it's extremely important that the masters of the universe right now, the oligarchs around the world, understand that, which they do, they very well do, which is why they're naively deluding themselves and building their billionaire bunkers, which can be overrun by the starving and the desperate. Okay, so unless there is a coming together, unless you have these unions finally succeeding, unions across industries succeeding in protecting their jobs, protecting a livable wage, protecting themselves against exploitation, if we can bring back the middle class, if we can bring back a strong social safety net, if we can build, hurry up and call a climate emergency that ushers in a sustainable global economy, if we can do that and stand a fighting chance and build a sustainable life on this planet. So we're being hit right now by two crises, and one is causing the other. And that is staggering levels of wealth and economy around the world, most notably here in the US, and the climate crisis. So people are getting obscenely rich off of destroying our planet and threatening the very existence of human civilization. And then through their wealth, through how they're amassing their wealth and how they're spending their wealth, because super yachts are super polluters, they are ushering in mass extinction, right? So these guys, the oligarchs, are not going to be able to survive the crisis they're creating. So again, I'm going to repeat myself. We are, in the coming decades, inevitably heading towards mass violence. And I'm making this point because I know, as a Gaslit Nation listener, you already know this, but please repeat this. Please add this to your pressure points and all the work that you're doing in your community, how you're unionizing, how you're having conversations with your family and friends. It is inevitable. That is where we're headed. And the David Zaslavs, the guy, the Ted Sarandos, the executives who are making hundreds of millions, the Bob Igers, that are making hundreds of millions of dollars and trying to bleed out writers and actors so they lose their homes, so they can't, so they struggle to put food on the table. Those guys are all part of this. It's all the same enemy we're up against, which is the greed of the corporate class, the greed of the oligarch class, and the ones that are threatening the very survival on this planet. So to the point of that Gaslit Nation listener, yes, you are right. Mass violence is inevitable, but it is not us who is going to fire the first shot, because once we do, we lose control. Instead, we have to go down to the basics of self-defense. I'm going to recommend a book that I know is controversial because it's a book that is adopted by the far left and the far right. But it's a book that is a reality. I've learned about this book through the war in Ukraine. There were people that were making copies of it for Ukrainian civilians to be aware of the advice in this book. And I think it's a book worth mentioning. Survivalists have adopted it widely. And it is, of course, you may already know what I'm talking about. It's Total Resistance, a guide by a Swiss army officer who was trying to prepare the civilian population in Switzerland should the country become occupied by the Iron Curtain going up. This was during the Cold War, the threat of Moscow imperialism, and obviously the Warsaw Pact countries were seeing civilians terrorized, mass arrests, mass murder, and the country just completely hollowed out inside through Soviet occupation. And so Total Resistance was an answer to that, on how civilians could live during a time of mass violence and occupation, and just practical steps they can take to defend themselves. I have a copy of the book. That doesn't make me a far-right extremist terrorist or a far-left extremist terrorist. It is, in its essence, a practical guide People should be aware of it, and people should have it, and people should continue to put pressure on the oligarchs and call out their behavior, because it is driving us. If they do not budge, if they do not come to the table, if they do not make our economy fair and sustainable, they are the ones who fired the first shot. All right, everyone. So that is my opening to this week's bonus episode. And now here is a clip from Sarah answering a question from one of our listeners. And if you want to hear the full episode, just subscribe to the show on patreon.com/gaslit. And thank you to everyone who supports the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Gaslit Nation Patreon bonus special. This is Sarah, and I am back after a couple of months where I wasn't on the show due to a number of deaths and terminal illnesses of people in my life. So not a great summer. I'm happy to be back, though, to answer your questions. However grim those questions may be. And with no further ado, we're going to get through this list. These are questions that have been sent in throughout the summer, so some of them are a little dated, but I think they're still, they shed some light on current events. So let's begin. The first question is from Jennifer, who says, Sarah and Andrea, how do you think global climate change and the global shift toward authoritarianism align, and or how can the future play out? Is there any historical blueprint or precedent that we can look to for what to expect and how to prepare our children? Yes, that's a great question. It's something that we talk about constantly on the show. The climate change features in all of our discussions of authoritarianism because the two are inseparable in terms of humanitarian crises, in terms of abuse of power, and in terms of the motivation of the agenda of this criminal elite, this plutocratic elite, that is not held accountable for their crimes against the public. In terms of historical precedent, we are in a unprecedented era to an extent in that we're seeing the result of the industrial age. We're seeing the results of predictions that were made about 50 years ago by people working for corporations like Exxon, documenting what the effect of fossil fuel consumption on a global scale was going to be on the environment. People have been warned for a very long time. I wrote about that, and they knew. I also wrote about how the people warning were labeled as hysterical alarmists. Another thing I wrote about, which I find very disturbing, is that when white settlers, colonizers, came to North America and wiped out Native American tribal civilizations, there was a decrease in the global temperature, by a significant amount. And that fact should chill you. But unfortunately, what we have among this plutocratic genocidal class are people looking at that as a model, as an example, saying, well, if the world is less populated, then that will be the way that we can stop global warming without having to give up our private jets, without the wealthy having to make any kind of sacrifices or corporations having to subtract anything from their bottom line. I think they think that depopulation is one means of dealing with the climate crisis. And that's also why they've allowed COVID to spread. It's why they have put forward policies like herd immunity, which are not real. Like if you get COVID repeatedly, it doesn't make you more immune. It makes you more sick. It hurts your body more and more frequently in the long run.